welcome back, Trinity Teens. It's been a couple of weeks. Last week we did the Zoom meeting in place of the weekly upload. We are just moving right along here in John. So if you followed the instructions at the beginning of the video, then you took the time to read the passage, and then you also took the time to watch that quick little video link that I have posted in the description. And that may or may not have made you a little misty-eyed or brought a tear to your eye. And that obviously, if you read the passage, then you saw how that new story plays into the passage that we're going over today. So we might talk about that a little bit more later. But chapter 9, as we continue here in John, is yet another case of Jesus doing one small act. Really, for him, it's a small act, but then it's a small act that has so many ramifications. And that's really the overall thought of chapter 9, is that through one small act of kindness, God's works are made known, and that brings the grateful to faith. But that also drives the prideful away. And that's as has happened so far in Jesus' ministry, as we've been studying, and will continue to happen. That's what the work of Jesus does. That's what the person of Jesus does. It is he either brings people to him, or people cannot accept who he is, and they push Jesus away. And so that's what we'll see here and what we'll study here in this passage. So the first thing we'll look at here is just the first 5 verses, and that's really the purpose of the miracle, okay? So let's jump right in here. In verse 1, it gives us the setting that Jesus, they're in Jerusalem, and his disciples, they pass by and they see a man who was blind from his birth. So Jesus and the disciples, they pass a blind beggar, okay? And the beggar is somewhat well known, so maybe this is really a spot that he typically sits at and begs. And so either he is well known, or even as he is sitting there begging, he is, as he's kind of announcing himself, he's making his misfortune known. Someone help me. I've been blind for as long as I've been alive. Ever since I was a baby, I've been blind. Somebody help me. Someone give. And so right off the bat, Jesus and his disciples know that this man has been blind since he was a little child, since he was a baby. And so that really brings up here a question from the disciples, and it's kind of a philosophical question. The disciples asked Jesus, "Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now, on the surface, it really seems like a good question, doesn't it? But if we think about it and diagnose it here a little bit, I think this gives maybe a little bit of a misconception that maybe the disciples have about God, and then often that people have about God, all right? Because the disciples essentially ask, whose fault is this, that this man was born blind? What did he do to deserve this? Was it his fault? Was it his parents' fault? What would a small baby do to deserve being born blind? And that kind of brings us to a very hard and realistic question. If it's the parents' sin that caused this baby's blindness, how is that fair for the baby? How is it fair for this man? It's not his fault. So that's the question that they're really posing here, and they kind of only have 2 answers. Whose fault is it? Whose sin was it that caused this? Was it the man's sin, okay? Or was it his parents' sin? So I'd submit that they kind of have a misconception about God when they ask this question. And it's a misconception that people can often have. So you think about this. Does sin and the habits of sin often have consequences? Yes, that's true. If you think about it, if a mother, while she's pregnant, if she abuses her body, if she, in our modern context, if she drinks alcohol, if she smokes, if she uh, takes drugs, the baby that she is carrying could very well have lifelong problems. And honestly, blindness is a consequence of actions like that for a baby. A baby can be born blind because of the self-abuse actions of the mother. But even then, that's not quite what the disciples are asking here. Okay? So as they present this question to Jesus, Jesus says, what does he say? He says, neither. He says, both the options you give, it's neither of those options. So the reason for this man's blindness, Jesus, first off, he states that this is not a consequence of sin. In verse 3, he says, neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents. So it's neither option that the disciples present. But so let's just summarize that real quick. What Jesus is saying is not about man's cause and effect, but it's rather about God's purposes. Okay? What's the reason? He says, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest or made known or revealed in him. So this is, again, and some people can have a hard time with this type of answer, but let's talk about it here a little bit. Jesus says, God is going to use this man's blindness for God's glory. Hard things can be used for God's glory and are often used for God's glory. Now, again, we should not diminish how hard life would have been for both this man and for his parents, because blindness is not an easy thing to live with. You and I who can see, we probably have no idea what it is like to be blind. We can try and imagine it. We can shut our eyes and we can maybe stumble around for a while, but we cannot truly imagine what it's like to have no sight, and like this man, to have never seen. Even the video that I had you watch at the beginning of someone who's colorblind, we can't even quite grasp that naturally, I don't think. It's a bit of a hard truth to reconcile. This man and his parents had to deal with his disability. Think about that, for his entire childhood. His parents had to work extra hard. They had to teach him slowly. They had to raise him differently than other parents have to raise their children who don't have disabilities. His parents had an extra difficulty in life because of their son's blindness. And we could only barely go into how hard life can be for a blind person. So this man he's never seen anything. His whole world has been darkness. And it's a hard thing to reconcile. Now here, let's be very clear. In Jesus' statement, is he saying that God caused this man to be blind? Look at the verse. Does Jesus say that? He does not. He does not say that God caused this man to be blind for his glory. Could God have caused this man to be blind? Yes, he could have. But that's not what Jesus says here. I would submit to you that God saw that this man was going to be born blind. He did allow it to happen. And he used this man's blindness for a specific purpose. He used this man's blindness to have him meet Jesus at this point in time. So, hard things can be used for God's glory. Hard situations can be used to showcase God, to make the works of God known, as Jesus says here. Because Jesus uses this as an opportunity to teach and to remind his disciples of what his purpose is. Okay? So, that being said, if you're taking notes, I want you to pause here and answer this question. What does Jesus mean in verses 4 and 5? In verses 4 and 5, what does Jesus mean? So again, Jesus is using this as an opportunity to teach, and we'll kind of answer the question as we go along here. So what's Jesus saying? What does he mean in verses 4 and 5? Let's answer that as we go along. Jesus says, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night comes when no man can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. So Jesus is presenting here really what his role is in regard to God's workings on earth. So Jesus' role in God's works, I should say. Let's just sum it up. Jesus is saying here in verses 4 and 5 that while he is on earth, he's only physically on earth for a limited amount of time. So while he's on earth and his physical time on earth is limited, his role on earth is to make God known, is to display God. He says, as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. That's one of the I am statements that John repeats, and that Jesus makes and John repeats throughout the book of John. Jesus is on the earth to make God the Father known, to reveal God the Father. Even as John, the disciple, pointed out in the very first chapter, man is in darkness, and Jesus is the light. Jesus is the revealer. We cannot see on our own. So Jesus came to earth to display God the Father and to shine that light into the darkness of man. So Jesus has a short time of ministry, but he's on earth to show God, to showcase God. And so he's going to do that through this very, very simple miracle here. For him, it's very simple. This next section, as Jesus performs this miracle, and then we begin to see the reaction to it, I call this the incredulity of the miracle, meaning that people are incredulous that this happens. So we'll start in verse 6 and we'll take this down through verse 17. That's where we'll end for the day. Okay, so Jesus' approach. Verse 6 says, when he had thus spoken, when he said that, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, go, wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. And he went his way therefore, and he washed, and he came seeing. So the first thing, what does Jesus do here? His approach is that, one, he makes clay in the dirt there, and then he rubs that on the man's eyes, but then he sends the man away and tells him to go and wash the clay off. So here's a question for you. I want you to pause here again if you're taking notes and answer this question. Why does Jesus heal the man like this? In that, I mean, why does Jesus make clay, put it on his eyes, and then why does he send him away? We'll answer that as we go through, but I want you to try and put an answer down, okay? Why does Jesus do that? All right, well, let's keep moving here. So as we've read, it says that the man, he went his way, he washed, he followed Jesus' instructions, and then he came seeing, or he returned being able to see. So it's so hard to imagine that he goes to the pool of Siloam blind, like he's always been. And as he washes away the mud, the clay, as it's called, suddenly he can see light. As he begins rubbing that mud out of his eyes and he's splashing the water up into his face, suddenly he can see something he's never seen before. Okay, he's never seen before. Something is happening that has never happened before, in that he is experiencing what it is to have light entering his eyesight, to no longer be in darkness. He's never experienced this before. And as he keeps on washing, suddenly there's blurry shapes, and as his vision totally becomes clear, and I would submit that as Jesus performed this miracle, this man had perfect vision. He had perfect 20/20 vision, and everything is suddenly crystal clear. Even for those of us who have glasses or should wear glasses or have contacts, our vision is not as clear as this man was. And suddenly the sounds and the smells and the things that he has touched, he suddenly has something visual to attach to all those things. And his whole world is changed. It's a pretty incredible miracle, and I think we could probably even take more time to think and meditate on it. So, as you can imagine, he begins telling people, okay, and people are beginning to recognize him, but there is this confusion to his identity, which is a little bit perplexing. Okay, there's a confusion to his identity. Verses 8 and 9, it says, "The neighbors therefore, and they which before had seen him that he was blind." Okay, so people who know him, they start saying, "Is not this he that sat and begged?" So people are questioning, is this the same person? And some people say, yeah, this is him. And others say, no, I don't think this is him. So there's disagreement on to his identity. There's confusion to his identity. And it makes you wonder, why is there this confusion? Even people who know him are confused. Is this the same person? And so you have to wonder if his eyesight or his lack of eyesight, if maybe there was some sort of maimedness to his face. And so maybe it's changed, him being able to see, it's changed his whole demeanor. Now, I'm certain it changes the way that he carries himself, the way that he walks, the way that he acts. It's changing everything about his demeanor. It makes you wonder what kind of physical change took place to his face. Or is it that some of these people, the ones who are questioning his identity, are so faithless that it's easier to believe this is a different person rather than a miracle has happened? Okay, those are really kind of the two options there, I would submit, is that either they're disbelieving or that him being able to see, there's things about him that have physically changed. So I definitely think and would submit that he carries himself differently. He's acting differently. You know, he's not feeling around anymore. Suddenly he's walking confidently and maybe even running, which is something he's never had the confidence to do, right? And so everything about him in some way has, maybe not everything, but he's changed so much. People are questioning his identity. And the news spreads. Therefore they said unto him, how were thine eyes opened? Everybody wants to know, how did this happen? So he begins telling them how this happened. He says, a man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed and I received sight. So he's repeating and he's telling people, as people are asking him and the crowd is probably growing, he's telling them about what has happened. And over, people are wanting to hear the story. And then they want to find the person who did this. Verse 12, and they said unto him, where is he? He said, I don't know. I don't know where this man is who did this. So this man who was formerly blind, he doesn't know who Jesus is. He knows his name, but he doesn't know where he is. He doesn't really know who he is. All he knows is that this man did something. He could feel the mud being rubbed into his eyes. Okay, he could hear what Jesus was telling his disciples, but he doesn't know who he is or now where he is. And so as the news spreads, the crowd then brings him to the Pharisees. And so here we go into the Pharisees' reaction. So John notes for us, as he has done before, that this miracle was, Jesus did this miracle on the Sabbath day. Okay? So let's bring us back to the question of why did Jesus perform the miracle the way he did? Okay? So what did he do? He spit in the dirt, and he mixed that dirt with the spit, making kind of mud, okay? We've probably all done that as kids. I would hope we've all done that, okay? It's good pastime, all right, if you're a child, play in mud, all right? But what did Jesus do in those things? Did he violate working on the Sabbath? The answer is actually no. Now, according to the Pharisees' standards, he did. Because if you remember, they have their own commentary, if you will, to Mosaic law, which is basically all the laws that they set up so that they make sure they don't violate keeping the Sabbath. So pastors even talked about this, well, in recent months as he's going through Mark, in that you're on the Sabbath day, according to the Pharisees, you're not even supposed to spit because that's technically doing work. You're making something happen. You're not supposed to knead dough. Okay, you're not supposed to make bread on the Sabbath day because that's working. And so if Jesus is mixing dirt and spit together, then he's working. He's putting forth physical effort. So according to the Pharisees, Jesus is violating the Sabbath. Has he actually violated the Sabbath? No, he hasn't. But to their standard, he has. So I think that plays into why Jesus did it that way. He did that on purpose. He didn't do it on accident. He did that on purpose. He healed this man on the Sabbath on purpose, and he did it with, he spit in the dirt and made mud on purpose. And then he sent the man away on purpose. We'll talk about that more, I think, in the next segment. So, as they want to hear it again from the man, it says the Pharisees asked him how he had received a sight in verse 15. You notice here his answer in verse 15. He's a little bit more succinct in how he replies, and I don't think he is. I don't think he's getting like irritated when he's repeating this. I think for the man, this is the best day of his life. Okay, but I think I would submit to you that Jesus is, or that the man here is a little bit more succinct in how he recounts what Jesus did for him, because he can sense the animosity of the Pharisees. Because he simply says in verse 15, he said unto them, he put clay upon my eyes, and I washed and do see. So he kind of skims over what Jesus had done. He didn't say Jesus made clay. He leaves that part out. He just says Jesus put clay on my eyes, which that wouldn't be a violation of the Pharisees' standard for the Sabbath day. So I wonder if the healed man here, if he's sensing the animosity. So then there's this disagreement of the leadership about Jesus. So some say this in verse 16, this man is not of God because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. He's violating the Sabbath. So this man obviously cannot be a spiritual minded man. So then there's the other Pharisees who say, well, wait a second, this is a miracle. How could a man who's living in sin, opposed to God, how could he do this miracle? How can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. Now, it's interesting that they then pose the question back to the man who was formerly blind. In verse 17, they say, what do you say about him, the one who opened your eyes? And the man's response is, he is a prophet. And we'll examine the man's views of Jesus more in the next segment. And this is where we'll end it here, is that the man, he obviously sides positively with Jesus. So we're going to end this segment here, okay? And I would encourage you, if you're taking notes, to continue to meditate on this passage, spend a few more minutes and write down other things that come to mind. But I would maybe bring us back to the beginning of the chapter and the point of application there. In that, at the beginning of this passage, this man is in a bad state. He's in the state he's been in his whole life of blindness. And Jesus takes this man's situation, and one, he changes the man's life. But he uses this man's situation for God's glory. We go through a lot of hard things, different. We can go on and on about the tough things that we experience, and some of us experience a lot tougher things than others. But you can be guaranteed that at some point in life, you are going to experience something hard that you don't understand why it's happening. And it may seem like God is the cause of it. You may not be able to see any reason why that hard thing is going on. But the thing that we have to come back to is that God always has purposes that we do not realize. And God has plans that we do not realize. And because something bad happens does not mean that God caused it to happen. People would try and twist that statement and we won't go down that path, but God is not the cause of evil. Sin is in the world. Bad things do happen. We will experience bad things. But God can and does use bad things, things that are bad in our minds, for his glory and for eternal purposes. And so that is maybe the truth to remind ourselves of, that God is always working and he can always work. So I hope that's an encouraging thought and maybe a challenging thought. And maybe that's the spot for you to try and think of what are hard things that I've experienced that I didn't understand right in the moment. And what are maybe the hard things that I'm experiencing right now that I don't understand? And again, what hard things will I experience? And I may not understand what's the reason in the moment. We have to always remember that God's in control and that he's always working. So, all right, we've gone on here for a little bit, so we'll pause it here and we'll pick up with the rest of the chapter in the next segment. So thanks for your time. Thanks for watching. Hope it's encouragement.